When Jaguar Wright broke her silence, she didn't accuse, and she didn't threaten. She did something far more disruptive. She reframed the conversation in a way the internet couldn't ignore. And suddenly, Teyana Taylor found herself under a level of scrutiny she hadn't faced before. This wasn't about one statement. It was about timing. For weeks, speculation had been circling quietly, unfinished stories, overlapping timelines, questions that never got follow-ups. Then Jaguar spoke. Calm, deliberate, unemotional. And the way she spoke mattered more than what she said. She didn't present receipts. She presented patterns. And patterns are dangerous when they feel familiar. Almost instantly, the narrative shifted. What had once been dismissed as online noise started feeling heavier. Comment sections changed tone. Reaction videos multiplied. Now, old moments were replayed through a new lens. Not because Jaguar confirmed anything, but because she validated the idea that silence itself can be strategic. That's where the serious trouble comes in. Not legal trouble, not criminal trouble, but narrative trouble. Once public attention reframes a story, control slips. Every past interview sounds different. Every pause feels intentional. Every boundary gets questioned. And when two powerful voices exist on opposite sides of the conversation, one choosing silence, the other choosing implication, the internet doesn't wait for clarity. It decides. Supporters rushed to defend Teyana's right to privacy. Critics argued that Jaguar had exposed a bigger issue about how stories are managed when influential names are involved. Neither side had proof, but both had conviction. And conviction spreads faster than facts. What made this moment explosive wasn't what Jaguar claimed. It was what audiences started believing once she spoke. Because once silence is framed as strategy, it stops protecting anyone. And when public perception shifts like that, the real pressure isn't external. It's losing control of the story entirely. When Jaguar Wright decided to speak, she didn't arrive with shock tactics. There were no screenshots flashed across the screen, no documents waved for effect. What she offered instead was far more destabilizing: context. And context, when it reframes a story already simmering online, can change everything. Before Jaguar spoke, the conversation around Teyana Taylor existed mostly at the edges. Fans whispered about unfinished narratives, moments that didn't quite add up, timelines that paused without explanation. It was the kind of low-level speculation that lives in comments and DMs, rarely breaking into mainstream attention. Easy to ignore, easy to dismiss. Jaguar's entry shifted that balance. She didn't accuse Teyana of wrongdoing. She didn't claim insider access to secrets. What she did was validate the idea that silence can be intentional, and that idea landed hard. Because once silence is framed as strategy, it stops being neutral. It becomes interpretable. Almost immediately, public reaction intensified. Reaction channels reframed their language. Comment sections sharpened. Old clips resurfaced, not as evidence, but as confirmation bias, moments now interpreted through a new lens. Nothing new had been proven, yet everything felt different. And this is where the phrase "serious trouble" started circulating, not as a legal implication, but as narrative pressure. When public perception shifts, control becomes fragile. Every past statement gets re-examined, every boundary sounds like deflection, and every pause invites projection. Supporters of Teyana pushed back quickly. They argued that choosing privacy is not a crime, that public figures are allowed to disengage, and that the internet often mistakes restraint for guilt, especially when women assert control over their narratives. To them, Jaguar's commentary was provocative but irresponsible, adding fuel to a fire built on assumptions. Critics heard something else. They interpreted Jaguar's tone, measured, deliberate, as credibility. Not because she offered proof, but because she articulated a familiar pattern. Stories that stall are questions that fade, attention that moves on right when it gets uncomfortable. For this group, Jaguar didn't create suspicion. She named it. The divide hardened quickly, and once sides form, nuance becomes collateral damage. What made this moment especially volatile was the absence of a clean counter-narrative. Teyana didn't escalate. She didn't clarify further. She maintained her boundary. From a personal standpoint, that consistency made sense. From a media standpoint, it created a vacuum, and vacuums get filled. Into that vacuum poured interpretation. Some viewers read dignity, others read calculation. The same silence supported opposite conclusions depending on what people already believed. And because Jaguar had legitimized the conversation around strategic silence, those interpretations felt less speculative, even without evidence. This is how narrative trouble works. It doesn't require wrongdoing. It requires reframing. Once a story is reframed as incomplete by design, the burden shifts. Silence no longer protects the subject. It challenges the audience to decide what it means. The media ecosystem amplified the shift. Headlines emphasized reaction over substance. Internet reacts replaced what was said. The focus moved from Teyana's actual words to the effect Jaguar's words had on public perception. In that translation, meaning mutated. Importantly, Jaguar never positioned herself as a prosecutor. She spoke like a commentator who has seen this cycle before. According to her framing, Hollywood doesn't thrive on chaos. It thrives on containment. When narratives get uncomfortable, they're not always denied. They're outlasted. That framing resonated because audiences have lived it. They've watched stories burn hot and then vanish. They've seen explanations arrive prepackaged and timed. Jaguar's commentary gave language to that experience, and once language exists, people use it. From that point on, every development, or lack of development, fed the same loop. No statement became a statement. No escalation became confirmation for some and confidence for others. The story stopped needing updates. It had momentum. This is why serious trouble doesn't mean consequences imposed by courts or contracts. It means losing narrative control. It means being discussed more for what isn't said than what is. It means existing in a story where interpretation outruns intent. And once that happens, the pressure isn't on the facts, it's on perception. Well, once Jaguar Wright reframed the conversation, the reaction didn't explode. It split. And that split is where narratives harden. Not through facts, but through alignment. People didn't ask, what happened? They asked, who do I believe? For Teyana Taylor, the backlash wasn't a single wave. It came in layers. The first layer was curiosity. Fans revisiting old moments, replaying interviews, scanning timelines. The second layer was interpretation, deciding what silence meant to them. The third layer was certainty, locking in a conclusion and defending it publicly. Supporters rallied around Teyana's right to privacy. They argued that the internet routinely punishes women for choosing boundaries, especially when those boundaries disrupt the audience's sense of access. To them, the backlash said more about entitlement than truth. Silence, and in their view, wasn't strategy. It was self-preservation. On the other side, critics framed the moment as overdue scrutiny. They didn't claim proof. They claimed pattern recognition. Too many stories pausing at the same point. Too many explanations arriving pre-packaged. Too many narratives cooling off right when attention sharpened. In their view, Jaguar hadn't accused. She had validated a suspicion people already carried. What made this phase especially volatile was how fast tone replaced content. Reaction videos weren't debating statements, they were debating intent. Comment sections weren't asking questions, they were declaring positions. Once positions are declared, nuance becomes irrelevant. Any new information, whether it clarifies or not, gets filtered through belief. Algorithms amplified the divide. A content that sounded decisive traveled farther than content that sounded careful. Here's what it means. Outperformed. Here's what we know. Over time, decisiveness felt like credibility, even when it was built on inference. Another accelerant was memory stacking. Viewers layered unrelated moments together, old photos, past collaborations, casual remarks, until they formed a narrative that felt complete. Completion matters more than accuracy in viral cycles. A finished story, even a speculative one, is easier to share than an unfinished truth. The absence of a counterstatement intensified everything. Teyana didn't escalate. She didn't clarify. She didn't attempt to reclaim the framing. That consistency protected her peace, but fed the machine. In attention economies, the silence doesn't pause conversation. It redirects it to those willing to speak. Media coverage mirrored the split. Headlines framed internet reacts instead of what was said. Panels debated optics rather than substance. The story became about reaction to reaction, a loop that sustains itself without new input from the source. This is where perception begins to settle. Not resolve, settle. The audience forms a memory even as the story remains incomplete. That memory isn't a claim, it's a feeling. The feeling that something was left unsaid, and feelings are sticky. Importantly, none of this required believing any specific allegation. Many viewers rejected speculation outright and still felt uneasy about the process. They weren't convinced of wrongdoing, they were convinced of opacity. And that distinction matters because it shifts the conversation from guilt to trust. As days passed, the backlash cooled, but it didn't disappear. It stabilized. The story stopped trending and started indexing. It became a reference point people would recall when similar moments appeared elsewhere. Silence here informed interpretation there. One unfinished story taught audiences how to read the next. This is the long tail of backlash. Not cancellations, not consequences. Context. Context that follows a name quietly, shaping how future narratives are received. Every pause gets weighed, every boundary gets reinterpreted. Even neutral actions acquire subtext. For commentators, this phase is profitable. For subjects, it's constraining. The loudest voices define the frame while the quietest carry it. And because no definitive claim exists to refute, the frame persists by default. What's striking is how little new information is needed to keep this alive. A single comment, a single appearance. Even a lack of response can restart the loop. The story's power now lives in expectation, not evidence. After the backlash peaked and the sides solidified, the noise didn't explode again. It flattened. This is the phase most people miss. Not the beginning, not the reaction, but the moment when a story stops moving forward and starts setting. By this point, Jaguar Wright had already said what she intended to say, and Teyana Taylor had already decided what she would not say. That combination created a familiar stalemate, one that media organizations understand well. Traditional outlets hesitate here for a reason. There's no new quote, and no verifiable allegation, no document trail. Without fresh material, reporting becomes repetition, and repetition without confirmation invites risk. Editors know this. Legal teams know this. So coverage shifts from investigation to observation. The internet reacts. Fans debate. Opinions are divided. The story is acknowledged, but not advanced. This is what quiet stabilization looks like. Stabilization doesn't mean resolution. It means the narrative has found a comfortable holding pattern. Everyone involved understands the boundaries. The media won't push without proof. The subject won't expand. Commentators will continue to interpret, and the audience will slowly adjust expectations. From a public relations standpoint, this phase is efficient. Attention naturally drifts. New headlines compete. Algorithms rotate. Without escalation, an outrage cools. But what doesn't cool is memory. The story transitions from trending topic to background context, and context is powerful. At this stage, silence starts working differently. Early on, silence invited speculation. Now, it becomes precedent. Viewers remember that this story paused here. They remember how it felt unresolved. So when a similar pause happens elsewhere, they recognize it faster. The lesson carries forward. This is why media hesitation matters. It teaches audiences how stories end when they can't be verified. Not with answers, but with ambiguity. And ambiguity, once normalized, reshapes trust. Another reason the story freezes is mutual exhaustion. Supporters have defended, critics have argued, everyone has chosen their interpretation. Without new input, repeating the same debate yields diminishing returns. So conversation slows, not because it's settled, but because it's spent. Yet spent stories don't disappear. They lodge. Reaction creators pivot their framing. Instead of breaking, content becomes reflective. Instead of exposed, it becomes remember when. The story gains longevity by becoming reference material rather than a headline. This is where narrative pressure quietly persists for the subject. Every future appearance is contextualized, not overtly, subtly. Interview questions avoid the topic, but audiences don't. Comments resurface it, comparisons revive it. Silence here doesn't create new waves. It creates undertow. Importantly, none of this requires believing Jaguar's implications or rejecting Teyana's boundaries. Someone can fully support privacy and still recognize how unfinished stories affect perception. And the issue isn't belief, it's how gaps are handled. Media professionals understand that clarifications don't always clarify. Sometimes they reignite, sometimes they introduce new angles. And when the cost of speaking outweighs the benefit, the rational choice is restraint. That doesn't mean guilt, it means risk management. But risk management has side effects. It teaches audiences that silence is a tool. And once audiences believe silence is a tool, they stop treating it as neutral. They start interpreting it as intentional, even when it's simply cautious. This is the paradox at the heart of modern celebrity narratives. The strategies that protect short-term stability often erode long-term trust. Not enough to cause immediate fallout, but enough to change how future stories are read. By the end of this phase, the narrative has effectively frozen. There's no climax coming, no reveal waiting, just a shared understanding that this story exists in an unresolved state. And unresolved states are sticky. They resurface in unrelated debates. They influence how credibility is assessed. They become shorthand for a broader feeling that some stories are managed rather than explained. That feeling doesn't accuse anyone. It just lingers. And lingering is the point. Quiet stabilization allows institutions to move on while audiences carry the residue. The cost isn't measured in headlines. It's measured in how quickly trust returns the next time. As the story cools, one final shift happens. Responsibility moves outward. It's no longer about what Jaguar said or what Teyana didn't say. It's about how audiences, creators, and media choose to handle ambiguity going forward. That's where the story heads next. Not toward answers, but toward consequences of normalization. Because when enough stories end this way, silence stops feeling temporary. It starts feeling structural. By the time the story stabilized, something subtle but lasting had already happened. Attention moved on, but context stayed behind. This is the phase where headlines fade and memory takes over, and memory doesn't need updates to keep working. For Teyana Taylor, the narrative didn't escalate. It settled. She didn't lose projects. She didn't face public confrontation. On the surface, nothing changed. But underneath, the story acquired weight. The kind that doesn't announce itself yet quietly influences how future moments are read. This is what reputation drag looks like. Not scandal. Not cancellation. Just a persistent layer of interpretation that follows someone from moment to moment. Every interview is heard through it. Every pause is measured against it. Even unrelated events get filtered through a memory of something that never fully resolved. What makes reputation drag so effective is that it doesn't require belief. Someone can fully support Teyana's right to privacy and still remember that the story stopped mid-sentence. That memory becomes background context. It doesn't accuse, it conditions. The same dynamic applies to Jaguar Wright, though in a different way. Her role became fixed as the voice that changed the framing. Whether people agreed with her or not, she was now associated with the moment the conversation turned from whispers to scrutiny. That association doesn't disappear. It becomes shorthand. This is how quiet endings shape long-term narratives. They don't close doors. They leave them slightly open. And open doors invite future reinterpretation. Media behavior reinforces this effect. When stories conclude without resolution, outlets don't revisit them directly. They reference them obliquely. A phrase like, "after earlier controversy" or "amid past speculation" appears without explanation. Over time, that language becomes normalized. The unresolved story becomes a footnote that follows the subject quietly. Public memory works the same way. Fans don't recall exact quotes. They recall feelings. The feeling that something paused. The feeling that clarity never arrived. Feelings are durable. They resurface whenever a similar pattern appears elsewhere, strengthening the sense that this wasn't an isolated moment, but part of a larger method. Importantly, this doesn't mean the public assumes wrongdoing. It means the public assumes management. That distinction matters. Suspicion doesn't need guilt to survive. It only needs opacity. And opacity, once normalized, teaches audiences to read between lines by default. This is the trade-off of containment. In the short term, silence reduces volatility. In the long term, it creates interpretive habits. Audiences learn that some stories end this way. They adjust expectations accordingly. The next time a narrative pauses, they don't wait for answers. They infer. From a reputational standpoint, that inference is costly. Not immediately, but cumulatively. Trust doesn't collapse, it thins. Each unresolved story adds another layer of skepticism. Over time, the polished narratives feel rehearsed even when they're sincere. Another effect is precedent. Once people accept that quiet endings are standard, they stop expecting closure altogether. That lowers the bar for explanation across the board. It also raises the bar for credibility. When someone does choose to explain, audiences scrutinize more intensely, comparing clarity against a backdrop of long-standing ambiguity. This is why stories like this matter beyond the individuals involved. They shape how celebrity culture is interpreted as a whole. The lesson audiences take isn't about who was right. It's about how power prefers to move, slowly, carefully, without final statements. The paradox is that this approach works until it doesn't. Each quiet ending makes the next one harder to sell. Each instance of ambiguity trains audiences to be more alert. Over time, the same strategy that once protected stability begins to generate suspicion on its own. By now, the serious trouble isn't an event, it's an environment. An environment where silence carries meaning, where absence becomes context, and where memory outlasts attention. What's left at this stage isn't a demand for answers. It's a recalibration of trust. Viewers don't ask, "What happened?" They ask, "Why does this keep ending the same way?" That question doesn't need an answer to persist. It just needs repetition, and repetition is exactly what quiet endings create. By the time the story reached this point, something important had shifted. Not publicly, not loudly, but psychologically. The audience had learned how this cycle ends, not with answers, but with acceptance of ambiguity. And once that lesson sinks in, it changes everything that follows. For Teyana Taylor, the situation never became about defending herself. She didn't engage, didn't clarify, didn't escalate. From a personal standpoint, that choice protected her boundaries. From a narrative standpoint, it did something else. It finalized the pause. The story didn't end. It concluded quietly. And quiet conclusions are powerful. They don't force belief. They allow it. What happens next isn't backlash or resolution. It's normalization. Audiences move on, but they move on with a mental note, not a verdict, just a reference point. The The next time silence appears around a similar situation, this memory activates. The next time a narrative stalls, people don't ask if it matters. They assume it does. This is where audience responsibility becomes unavoidable. Stories don't gain power on their own. They gain power through engagement, through repetition, through confidence. The most decisive interpretations travel farthest, not because they're accurate, but because they feel complete. Over time, the audience trains the system to reward certainty over nuance. That training has consequences. Creators learn that ambiguity performs. Commentators learn that implication outpaces explanation. Media outlets learn that summarizing reactions is safer than pursuing clarity. And public figures learn that silence, while effective short-term, reshapes how they're understood long-term. This isn't about blame. It's about feedback loops. Once ambiguity becomes profitable, it multiplies. Once silence becomes normalized, it spreads. The ecosystem adapts around what's rewarded, and right now, ambiguity is rewarded more than resolution. For Jaguar Wright, this moment reinforced her role in the public imagination. Not as a prosecutor or authority, but as a disruptor. Someone who changes framing without closing the case. Whether people agree with her or not, her voice altered how silence was interpreted. That influence doesn't disappear, it lingers. The real shift, though, belongs to the audience. Viewers now watch differently. They don't wait for statements, they watch timing. They don't listen only to words, they read gaps. They don't assume silence is neutral, they test what it protects. This heightened awareness isn't cynical. It's adaptive. But adaptation cuts both ways. When audiences default to suspicion, even healthy boundaries feel strategic. Not even genuine privacy gets reinterpreted. That's the cost of repeated quiet endings. Trust becomes conditional. Clarity becomes suspect. Every story carries the weight of past ambiguity. This is why the serious trouble was never about exposure. It was about losing control of interpretation. Once audiences feel trained to fill gaps, the original voice loses authority over meaning. The story belongs to whoever frames it most confidently. So what actually ends this cycle? Not a confession, not a denial, not a viral reveal. What ends it is changing what gets rewarded. When audiences slow down instead of rushing to conclusions. When creators choose context over certainty. When media outlets resist turning silence into implication. When viewers remember that not every unfinished story hides something, and not every boundary is strategy. That doesn't mean ignoring patterns. It means observing them responsibly. The difference matters, because stories like this don't collapse institutions. They reshape culture. They teach people how to read between lines, how to expect less clarity, how to live with unresolved narratives. Over time, that shapes everything, from celebrity coverage to public trust. And once that shift happens, it doesn't reverse easily. The final takeaway isn't about who was right or wrong. It's about recognizing the power of silence in a system that thrives on attention, and understanding that silence only works as long as audiences accept it without question. This story didn't end with answers. It ended with awareness. Awareness that ambiguity isn't accidental. Awareness that narratives are shaped as much by what's withheld as what's shared. An awareness that once people learn to watch the pauses, they never stop noticing them. And that awareness, that's the real legacy of this moment. Not trouble, not scandal, but a permanent change in how stories are read. You've seen how this unfolded, from silence to speculation, to a story that never needed proof to feel finished. And now the real question isn't about headlines anymore. It's about how we, as the audience, decide what matters. So let's talk. Do you think Jaguar Wright crossed a line by reframing the conversation? Or did she simply say out loud what people were already noticing? And when Teyana Taylor chose silence, was that strength? Or did it unintentionally hand control of the narrative to the internet? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Not hate, not assumptions, real observation. What patterns have you noticed in celebrity stories that seem to pause instead of end? Which moments never fully made sense to you, even years later? If this breakdown helped you see how narratives are shaped, not just what they claim, hit like so more people see context instead of just thumbnails. Subscribe for long-form, documentary-style videos that slow the noise down and examine the system behind the stories, not just the drama. And most importantly, share this with someone who only saw the title. Because the internet moves fast, but understanding shouldn't be rushed. This isn't about canceling anyone. It's about questioning silence, rewarding clarity, and refusing to let ambiguity do all the talking. Stay curious. Stay observant. Because once you learn to watch the pauses, you never stop noticing them.